Well, I'm Richard Griffin. I'm Uncle Steve's nephew, and we just loved and admired him so much. And I'm going to share some memories and hopefully some funny stories that I have, and also some other family members. He was certainly a humble Christian, and he had a strong faith in God, and he had a limitless love for his family. My brother Johnny wanted to be here, but he wrote this to me about Uncle Steve. He said, family was a key part of his life. He loved Aunt Seal, Stephen Bradley, Leslie, Grandpa, Grandma, Jonathan, and all the grandchildren and his siblings immensely. After Christ, they were the center of his life. And that is certainly true. And when I think of Uncle Steve, I think of Micah 6:8. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And Uncle Steve did that. He lived a Christ-like life, and he loved other people. He helped other people whenever he could. And he was humble because he always wanted the glory to go to God. He, all of his blessings, he said there was God-given. Now, when I was little, I would think of Uncle Steve, and he would come to town a lot, and we'd get so excited because he was always the cool uncle. I mean, he would play games with us, and it was so much fun. And there was a game called Risk that's a board game where you're trying to take over the world. And he loved that game, and we would play it, and sometimes it would get a little hot, but you're trying to take over the world, and so we had a good time with that. Beth and I have Victoria, Nicole, Caitlin, and Mackenzie, and they remember one time when Aunt Seal and Uncle Steve came to our house in Snellville, Georgia, and they got snowed in, and they played in the snow with them, and then they played Simon Says, and apparently they remember this, and they said that they woke up that morning and they left early, and they were so disappointed because they'd had so much fun playing Simon Says with Uncle Steve and Aunt Seal. They also came to town. They didn't miss anything when it came to something that was important to the family. And one of the things that he loved to do is to come to town at Christmas and see that all four girls were in the dance school at the School of Dance at our Christian high school and elementary school that they went to. And they would do a Christmas dance recital, and he would come and he would say that just made his trip. He always enjoyed that. And to be honest with you, sometimes watching other people dance, their children dance, isn't necessarily that much fun, but Uncle Steve certainly enjoyed it. I also remember a time when we went to the lake, and Uncle Steve was very determined. If he saw something and he wanted to do it, he was going to try it. And so we were kneeboarding, and the boat pulls you, and you're hanging onto that board, and you've got to pull yourself up, and then you ski back and forth. And all the four girls did it, and Beth did it, and I did it. And so Uncle Steve, who's in his 70s, he said, I want to do that. And I said, are you sure, Uncle Steve? It's not easy. He says, I'm going to do it. So he jumped in the water, and I put the boat into gear, and we pulled him. And he was just doing everything he could, just practically drowning with the water at his face. And he couldn't quite pull up, and it threw him into the water. And I thought, one and done. That's going to be it. So I pulled around, and he said, again. And I went, oh. So we did that 3 times, and I thought, well, surely he's done now. The 4th time, he says, all right, I give up. I'm out. Johnny, like I said, my brother, he certainly loved Uncle Steve, and they had a special relationship because they loved to sing. And we have lots of family that have sung at funerals and other things, but Uncle Steve would come to town for his little church's Christmas concert. And Uncle Steve would learn the music, and he would sing, he had that beautiful tenor voice, and he would sing his solos. And then Johnny called them the Griffin family singers. They would perform, and then they would all sing in the choir. And Johnny always laughed that he got away with calling it the Griffin singers because really 3 of them were Joneses, so it should have been called the Jones family singers. But he always wanted to take them on the road because he said with Uncle Steve singing lead, they could have taken it on the road. Well, Johnny wrote this about Uncle Steve and his singing. He said, Uncle Steve is singing in the heavenly choir, surrounded by loved ones, enjoying the richness of Christ. It's a party with no curfew. It will last forever, all eternity. Uncle Steve, we love you and miss you and treasure your life as one changed by Christ. Now, I also have a story that Mom gave me, Lavinia Griffin, and they had a special tie, Uncle Steve and Mom, and she was so excited when she was little because they said, you're going to have a playmate. She had the older sister and the older brothers, but they were a little bit older, and so she was about 3, a little bit less than 3, and she said she was so excited about her playmate Steve. So Stephen was born, and so they brought her in. They pulled the blanket back. She was in a little bassinet. And she looked in and expecting a toddler for some reason. And instead she said, "Is that all there is?" Well, they had a special tie, and they, it seems like, traveled the world. Every time they would be on one trip, Mom said he'd be planning 2 or 3 more. So that was a special tie. And I remember when she had her knee replacements, each time he came and stayed with her for weeks and weeks to take care of her. And she had said that she kind of underestimated him because when he was little and expecting one bigger, she kind of looked out for him, but quickly he loved and supported and took care of her. Now, I do have a story from Leslie that she told me. She and Claire were meeting Uncle Charles and Uncle Steve at the DC train station, and she had a tracker, and she really liked to keep track of her dad and make sure he was okay. And so they decided that they weren't there yet, but they'd play a trick on him so they could see where he was and which store he was in. And she said, "Papa, I'm here, come on out and find me in the mall." And he'd walk out there and look, and of course she'd laugh and laugh because she was still on the train and she wasn't even there. And then Stephen Bradley told me a good story that was really, really funny this past weekend when they came to stay with us. And it was when he was moving. He'd sold his house and he was trying to move out from the Miami Shores house. And they had worked so hard. It sold really quickly, and they had just a short period of time to get out. And so the truck was loaded and the dumpster was loaded, and they had a pile of trash that were in bags. And he had called to have the garbage truck come pick that up. And so they drove up, and there was about 100 bags, and they grabbed 2 of them and threw them in and just drove off. And Uncle Steve was like, "Oh no!" So he got a little bit angry, and he grabbed a can of paint and tossed it at the garbage truck and almost hit his own car, but luckily no one was hurt in that little event. Well, Uncle Steve was strong and courageous, and he loved adventure. And I think of Joshua 1:9 when I think of Uncle Steve. "Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And he had God with him. A lot of places around the world, that's for sure. He also liked to give a gift to his brothers. When Uncle Charles was very sick and fighting cancer, and he decided he was going to give him a road trip. And so they went on a road trip to let him say goodbye and see things. And then he took Uncle Reed to Kentucky. And when I was talking to Uncle Steve, he said, "I'm a little torn because Uncle Reed, he thinks that a salesman took him to Kentucky where he broke his leg." And he goes, "I really felt like I need to tell him it was me, but I don't want him to be mad at his brother." So he decided he'd just let the salesman take the fall. Well, I did get to have lunch with Uncle Steve right before they were going on their Viking cruise. And it was really the only time I've ever had a one-on-one. And so Uncle Steve and he had very strong opinions about everything, and I do as well, and they happened to match just perfectly. So when we had lunch, we just went through all the things you should never talk about because there's going to be fights if you do, and we raised our voice in agreement on everything. So we really enjoyed it. We got into politics and religion and everything that you can think of. He did tell me that Uncle Seal had died 9 years before that, and that he had read that the life expectancy of a widower had been married for a long time. It was 9 years. So he knew the time was coming close. And of course he had the lung cancer that he was fighting, but he still wanted that trip. And he was at peace. He really was. He was ready whenever God said it was time. And when they were on that Viking cruise, Mom said that he was like a kid in the candy store. He was seeing all those things in Berlin and different places in Germany that they'd seen when they were there. He had studied them. He would call Mom and say, "Hey, I've just found out this, that, and the other about these things we're going to see." So he really enjoyed that trip, and that was something that he was bound and determined to go on. No matter what people tried to say, if they said, "Don't do it," he said, I'm going to go. When they tested positive, I'll never forget the phone call that we've tested positive, and you're afraid. But their faith was strong. And they really leaned on Philippians 4:6-7. "Do not be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ." The family rallied, and I know that Leslie's going to talk about that, but we rallied, we prayed, we grew very close together very quickly, became a team to get them life lighted out because that's what they needed, and we're so thankful because Mom's here today, and Uncle Steve had some precious, precious time with Leslie and Stephen Bradley and Jonathan. And when they would communicate, he was on a ventilator, but they said that they would write. He'd write on a erase board, and he was saying, "I love you, and I want you to be okay." And he'd point an arrow up. He said he's ready. I really think that we also found out that the doctor said when they stopped the chemo, that meant his 1 year left would probably be about 2 months. And so if he'd survived COVID, and we certainly were praying for that, it would have been another battle. So I think God was merciful. I think God was ready to bring him home. And there's a verse, Isaiah 57:1, that says, "Sometimes the righteous are taken away to be spared from an evil to come." So he didn't have to endure the dying of lung cancer. And now he's got a brand new body, and he's in paradise with his family. Uncle Steve will miss you terribly. We're rejoicing that you're in paradise because of your Savior, Jesus Christ. And I can imagine God in heaven saying, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Your life was well lived." Our loss is truly heaven's gain, and we look forward to seeing Uncle Steve again one day in heaven. Thank you.
I'm Stephen Jones. I'm Stephen's son, and this is my sister, Leslie. And we just want to share a few words about what God has done for us and our family in the last few days, and also what was really important to my father.
There are many blessings, even through the tears. Daddy was so excited about going on the cruise from Germany to Prague. At the end of the cruise, I didn't hear anything for a couple of days, although I knew he was in Prague since I tracked his every move. Then the dreaded call came in. I missed the call, but he left me a voicemail. He said that he and Aunt Lavinia had both tested positive for COVID, so they will have to stay in Prague for a little while longer. Even with this diagnosis, he was upbeat, still laughing in his voicemail. We discussed ways for Daddy and Aunt Lavinia to escape Prague. There was too much risk for them to go to the airport because they could be thrown in jail. We talked about flying them home on a private jet. Daddy was thinking about how much that would cost. I started looking into hiring a private jet while his condition worsened. Daddy called me November 7th and said, "I'm ready to pull the plug." I quickly said, "What plug?" I wasn't sure if he wanted to end his life or hire a plane so he could end the trip. He quickly said, "The plane." It took a whole team: my son Jonathan, my cousin Richard, his wife Beth, Richard's aunts Becky and Alice. As Daddy's health declined, Richard, Beth, and I decided that they must go to the hospital to get oxygen while we worked on arranging the plane. We finally got the air ambulance arranged, but over the next couple days, the medical team had to change their plans and planes to accommodate Daddy's worsening condition. It felt like it was never going to happen, or like we might be getting scammed. Finally, 2 planes were arranged, and Daddy would leave Saturday morning. The night before, his medical flight crew were to rescue him. It was so difficult for Daddy. Time slowed down. Minutes seemed like hours. Daddy said it was the longest night of his life. This night was so very precious to me because he just wanted to be on the video call with me all night. At one point, he wanted to hear Jim Brady, so I would play it over the phone, but he couldn't hear it well. So I sent him a link where he could play it over his phone. When he realized he couldn't play the music and have me on video call, he said, "Well, I'll stay on the phone with you then." We stayed up together the whole night, just looking at each other over the video call, counting the hours down. That was the most precious time I spent with Daddy. We were thrilled to see the flight crew show up at the hospital room, but as they prepped him for the trip, the flight crew received a call that there was bad weather in Iceland and the flight had to be rescheduled for the next day. This was the most devastating news. Now he would have to wait another day in that awful hospital. Daddy really turned for the worse that night and no longer had the strength to even talk. Daddy did make it out of the hospital the next day and unfortunately had to be intubated and placed on a ventilator on the way to the Prague airport. I was so worried about the weather in Iceland because I saw online that the weather was the same as the previous day, but I knew God had this. God had this all planned out. Even though I don't know why Daddy had to wait so long to leave Prague, I know it was God's timing. It was a true miracle getting them back to the United States, but there were more miracles and blessings God gave us. When Daddy finally arrived at Duke, God made a way for me to jump on that ambulance and hold my daddy before they rushed him into the ER. The ER doctor told me how lucky Daddy was because an ICU bed just opened up for him, even as they were sending patients off to other hospitals.